Hi, welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel. I think you know me by now, so I don't have to remember the second half of my name. I've got a great guest on with me today, Professor Jo Smith OBE, who's been a campaigner for suicide prevention in students, and was recently awarded an honorary doctorate by Middlesex University, I think, and probably has one of those long list of letters after her name. She's a psychologist, all-round good egg and successful person who's I'm very glad has joined us today. She's just come back off holiday, so I think she's jumped into this show still trying to catch up with her emails. So I'm very grateful for Jo. Hello, Jo. How are you doing? Welcome.
Hello. Yeah, fine, thank you. Yes, yeah, I'm fine.
How was your holiday? Did you go somewhere nice?
It was good. It was a wedding. It was a wedding fest in Toledo over several days. So yeah, too many Aperol spritzes and just generally enjoying time with family friends. Yeah,
Wonderful.
nice.
That sounds great. Where are you based, Jo?
I'm based in Worcester and I'm an emeritus professor, which means I'm a retired professor, but I'm still working. I've retired twice in the course of my career already.
Retire in your profession.
Yeah, and people joke. So I'm at University of Worcester and still doing quite a bit of work there, largely around project work and some research involvements.
Right.
But I'm semi-retired.
I don't know. We never really retired, do we? We sort of like something bumble along doing bits and bobs. Is Worcester where you're from originally? Is that your sort of...
No, I moved here when I met my husband, who's a GP, who was a GP here. He's now retired. And when you meet a GP, you tend to marry a place as well. I'm grateful because I was in Birmingham at the time. I'd been in Birmingham. I like Birmingham. I was there as a student and I was there working in my early career. And then, moved over to Worcester. And it's great because I'm a cyclist and quite sporty. And so it's great here because you've got access to the Malvern Hills and out to countryside very quickly. And it's beautiful bit of the country. And it's always been very...
Where did you grow up then? Where was your
Stone in Staffordshire.
Okay.
So that was where my father came from. And it was in a sort of era where all my aunts and uncles lived in the same town. You know, we're much more mobile now as a generation, really. And so I grew up there, and then my father worked for Joel's of Stone, which is it was a brewery, but also a wine merchant, and he was their wine taster.
Okay.
He used to go buying wines, and then he moved over to Birmingham with Bass Mitchells and Butlers when they took over Joel's. So he worked in Birmingham then, and we moved to Burton-on-Trent, which is where my parents are now dead, but my sister still lives in Burton-on-Trent.
They've always been sort of Midlands type area.
Yeah, I'm a Midlands girl. My accent always sounds further north, people say, but I think that's the Burton U always sounds sort of more northern. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Birmingham, so I know the area well.
Yeah.
That's my background. And so Staffordshire Potteries.
Yeah, that's right. Wedgwood and Trentham Gardens and Ballet Orchestra, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I don't think people understand because the Midlands are often associated with the Industrial Revolution, of course, and all that sort of stuff and high industrialization. But there's a lot of really beautiful,
stunning
country around there, even in Birmingham itself, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think I mean, certainly I appreciate where we lived. We used to go up to the Roaches and Dovedale and out that way. And again, with my sister in Burton-on-Trent, when we lived in Burton-on-Trent, you know, out into Derbyshire, some beautiful, beautiful areas.
Can't be the Dales.
No, but even in Birmingham, I have to say, you know, I lived in Selly Park and King's Heath, and there's beautiful parkland from some of these manor houses around. And again, you can quite quickly get out into countryside as you move over sort of towards out of Birmingham. Yeah.
Second half of my childhood was in Kings Norton, which you will know.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That area. So we were right on the green belt, and We used to
Absolutely.
go out in the green belt and go hedge rowing as a kid. So
Yeah.
we get all the
Hmm.
hops and the berries and everything from people don't think about it in that way. So sort of don't really isn't what comes to mind. But I had a very country upbringing in many ways,
Yeah.
actually. Secondly.
Well, I worked in the NHS,
Yeah.
and for 27 years, I mean, the first what was it, 1, 3, 5, yeah, 5, 7 years I was in Birmingham around Winson Green. I worked at All Saints Hospital, and then I moved over to Worcestershire. And I think what people don't appreciate, and I try and put it in context, it's a county that's about 70 miles by 90 miles. And although it's got sort of 6 market towns, it's very much country. And certainly the last 16 years of my career, I was home visiting, going out to see young people. And as a result, just I thought, how lucky is this to be able, in the course of your work, certainly in the summer, spring and summer, I thought, how lucky.
The
When
winter.
it was winter and ice and snow, I didn't think I was lucky, because I was often ploughing through snow or ice to get out to see people all over the county. And of course, we had Hollywood at one end and Broadway at the other of the county. So when I used to do teaching or used to go and do conferences, I used to say, of course, we had Hollywood and Broadway, but it wasn't quite the ones they were thinking of.
I've actually been to that Hollywood.
Yeah.
It's different to the one in the Midlands a little
It
bit.
is. It is.
The weather's different as well.
Yeah.
So interesting sort of, I mean, you seem to have had the sort of change in life that was familiar to many people of our generation, actually. My parents come from a manual labor sort of my mum moved up in some of the ranks, but I moved into social care and health and social care, and a lot of people did. The opening up of university to sort of, I guess you would have thought of yourself as working class growing up.
Yeah, yeah. My mum was a mental health nurse, so
Right.
maybe that had an influence. But she was in the generation post-war, which is when you got married, you had to give up your job. She worked at St George's in Stafford, and she was a matron there. And but she was quite a feminist, and she really, really struggled with being dependent financially upon my dad. So
Yeah.
once we were old enough as kids, she retrained as a registrar of births, deaths, and marriages, and did that for the rest of her
Right.
sort of later career. But she always taught me never be beholden to a man for money, which my husband, who is extremely generous, struggles with, because I have always been fiercely independent and kept my own single name for work.
Right.
And
Right.
part of that, I think, was some of the messaging from my mum,
Yeah.
from her history of having to give up work just because she married someone.
And so
Um,
with both you and your sister, she was encouraged you to get an education and get qualifications
We
and
had, yeah, there were 4 in the family. I had 2 brothers, one of whom's he died, and yeah, so 2 brothers who they're quite a bit older than me. My mum had a boy who was 11 years older than me, and then another boy who was 7 years older than me, and really wanted a girl. And blow me, ended up with 2 girls separated by 2 years.
right,
So she sort of had a bit of a spaced out set of children, but actually we get on very, very well
right,
as a family. Sadly, my elder brother died of a brain tumor in his sort of late 50s.
right,
But yeah, my parents definitely invested in education. They weren't wealthy, and we certainly didn't. There wasn't a lot of money around growing up, and it was because they were very keen on investing in education. And my 2 brothers got grammar school it was when you did 11 plus and you
yeah,
could
yeah,
get grammar school places. So they got grammar school places and both did well. One went into journalism, one went into teaching. But when my sister and I took our 11 pluses, it was there weren't free places at the sort of the equivalent of grammar schools for girls, so they actually paid for our education,
Right.
which meant we had caravan holidays maybe once every couple of years or so.
Yeah.
Their first time ever abroad was when I was in my late 20s, where they did their first holiday abroad, which of course we don't think about now.
No,
But they
that's not-
felt
yeah.
the best gift they could give us was investing in education, and hopefully, I think they feel it's paid off. My sister went into banking, and I went
Right.
into mental health. Yeah,
I mean, I think it can't be argued other than education is a good thing. I
yeah,
know not all children successfully do it, and particularly children in neurodiverse struggle in schools.
mm,
You know, I hear that, but actually investing in education is a really wise and sensible thing to do. And I'd go further to say lifelong learning as well, I think
yeah,
is and I agree.
absolutely. Because sometimes people struggle to learn with we sort of put sort of um, set points on it, like in terms of GCSEs or A levels or going to university. And in fact, some kids maybe struggle with that and mature later or develop later.
Yeah.
And also, people can learn in different ways. And I think, you know, that if you're academically inclined, then maybe our system works well. But if you're very practically or technically inclined, I think we do less well. Though with the new apprenticeships and things like that, then hopefully that offers
They do,
alternative pathways.
they do seem
And
like a good idea. Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
would.
I worried when with the widening access for universities, with now over 50% of young people, that university isn't for everyone. It's not a panacea, and I'm glad that we're supporting and developing other routes for people to gain qualifications.
I would agree. I didn't do so well as an undergraduate. I sort of left it. I did go back and actually got on a professional training, which was a postgraduate course later,
Mhm.
but mostly because I'd got some work experience. So I had accreditation prior learning, which you understand what that
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
My
yeah,
life experience was used as a qualification, and I think that made sense for me. And I really support um, people finding their own journey through these things. I do think, I don't know what you think, it's not really on topic, but we'll say it. I think it's connected to the topic. I think there's a lot of pressure on kids these days that I didn't have.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I think it's too much, to be honest.
yeah. Well, also, I feel the pressure. I mean, when I went to university, you sort of felt as a graduate, you pretty much were that employment opportunities would open up for you.
Yeah,
And I've seen it with my own lads. I've got two sons. When they finished university with good degree qualifications and then were applying to get onto graduate schemes, and the hoops they had to jump through, you know, 4 or 5 different levels of interviews, telephone interviews, psychometric testing,
yeah,
group exercises. And quite a lot of young people struggle to get on to something. And I suppose when you've invested a huge amount of money and people have set you up saying a degree will set you up, and then finding that you don't find employment, it's extremely disheartening. And now
yeah,
generally people need something else. They need a master's
yeah,
or something on top.
yeah.
And I do think we put a lot of pressure on little children in terms of the SATs assessment and
Yeah,
various pressures. And I'm not sure that's necessarily helpful when you look at perhaps other countries and cultures who maybe don't place that same emphasis and place much more emphasis on play and social learning and just enjoying those very younger years. And
yeah,
I feel because anxiety can develop, develops in primary years, that unfortunately we're actually maybe contributing to it with
yeah.
both parental expectations, teachers' expectations, and just trying to funnel through kids through assessments,
Yeah.
which may not necessarily be that helpful, would be my personal view.
Yeah, I see a lot of kids with anxiety these days, and it's not simply because of the pandemic, which is sort of
No.
the thing.
And it's also not,
People like
and
to
it's
drop
also
out.
not just social media as well. I think
No, it's not at all.
there are a lot of different pressures. Yeah.
I think
Mm.
there are new pressures on children that never existed in
Yeah.
when I was growing
Yeah.
up. That's the truth.
Yeah.
When I listen to children now talking about their life, there are pressures that they have, which I think if I'd had as a child, it would have been really, really quite difficult. And as you say, the expectations on succeeding in a particular way as well is
Yeah.
difficult. What took you into psychology? Because you're a psychologist, aren't you?
Okay. Well, I had a hiccup at my A levels because I actually had places to do medicine at Bristol and Cardiff
Okay.
and didn't get the grade I required in physics, got a D. And both universities said, go back and retake it, do another year at school. But I would have been the only one going back. All my mates were going off to uni. And I think I was really shocked. Well, everyone was shocked. My parents were shocked, teachers were shocked. No one knew what to say to me. No mates knew what to say to me because I was expected to do well. And my only rationale for it was that the examiner couldn't read my writing. That was my rationale, and I never tested it out, by which they offered to resend my papers off in case it turned out that I really had messed up my physics A level. So my brother actually stepped in, and he was a teacher, so he was free that summer, and he came down and took me off to various universities to think what I might do. And it happened to be a neighbour's daughter who was a clinical psychologist who said, if you're so determined to go to university rather than resit, then psychology is a good degree to do because it opens up options. It's a good general degree and it won't close off options.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, my brother and parents took me over to Birmingham and they offered me a place and I loved it. I loved it from day one. And I got the first year prize. I loved it. And I went on and got a first and adored it. And then went to work in a psychiatric hospital, St Margaret's Hospital in Walsall, as well as Learning Disabilities Hospital, as a psychology assistant for a year.
Yeah.
And then got on to clinical psychology training at Birmingham.
Yeah.
So I did that for 2 years, which is it's a placement-based training.
Yeah.
And then qualified as a clinical psychologist in 1984. And already one of my placements, I had worked at All Saints Hospital with someone called Professor Max Birchwood. And Max had just finished his PhD looking at the needs of families coping with schizophrenia.
Right.
And for my master's project, I worked with families through what was National Schizophrenia Fellowship, now called Rethink.
Yeah.
And actually, there was very little information at that time available for families. In fact, for lots of different reasons, families perhaps were not involved in care, and so were left struggling.
Yeah.
And so with families, and I wrote some information booklets for families called Coping with Schizophrenia. And I evaluated those in both as booklets and videos and went around various National Schizophrenia Fellowship organisations and ran groups. And that then took me we applied for a grant for me to develop that work and develop interventions for families. And so for the next 5 years, we developed something that was one of the first family services for families with schizophrenia in England. And it was based at the Archer Centre in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And it was called the Family Care Service. And so that took me into working with families, and particularly families right at the onset of psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And initially I worked sort of across the range with families where perhaps a relative had been unwell for 20 years or longer, and as well as some what we call first episode families, in other words sort of much younger, sort of in their sort of late teens, early 20s. But gradually over the course of my career, I decided if I was going to be really effective, I wanted to move upstream to where problems had their onset. So for the second half of my NHS career, I always have worked in psychosis, always worked, so schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and various forms of psychosis. But for the latter half, I moved to first episode psychosis.
So
And
what I want to do is, I mean, because I think people will be listening to this, and I'd like to put a context on this, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Because mental health, particularly with severe and enduring mental health issues, such as the ones you're describing, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, these are very severe issues and very serious issues. And there have been two streams, if you like. They're not mutually exclusive, but just so people understand, there's been a psychiatric model and then a psychological model. And they're not, like I say, they're not opposites at all, certainly not these days. But certainly, like my experience of when I first started in the NHS, working in hospital closure programs and moving people into community care, was that you would never come across, for example, a consultant psychologist. It was always a consultant psychiatrist. It's always very medical. These days, of course, it's much more normal to have a consultant psychologist and to have a psychological approach.
Yeah.
Could you just, I mean, I guess you
Yeah.
understand what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Could you
Yeah.
just, for people who are listening, just maybe explain that difference, what that
Okay.
is, and the gradual shift into psychological processes to the point where, for example, people won't know this, you'll know what I'm talking about here. The NICE guidelines now around the treatment of psychosis in the community are all psychological, and they've asked for more evidence to have psychosocial interventions in the ward, so that would be the first choice. And that's been a gradual move from, if you like, psychiatric medical interventions to psychological, psychosocial interventions. Do you mind saying something about that?
Yeah.
Understand?
I think one thing, certainly in severe and enduring mental, and the reason why these issues can be quite complex is because they tend to recur. 50% of people tend to have repeat episodes, and they can lead to an impact more broadly than health on people's education, employment, their social functioning, all of those kind of things. But I'm going to talk about early intervention in psychosis in a minute and explain a little bit about that model. But in fact, psychology and psychiatry, I think, work hand in glove in quite a complementary way. And although NICE certainly advocates psychological and psychosocial interventions, so things like cognitive behavioural therapy for psychosis, things like family intervention, family support, care, education and support. It also includes things like helping people get back into education and employment through things like individual placement support schemes. So it does do that, but I have to say that certainly equally, in terms of perhaps managing distressing symptoms so that people perhaps feel in a position to really take on board psychological approaches or consider going back to work, that medical approaches, pharmaceutical approaches are very helpful. When the antipsychotic medication was first introduced in the late 50s, it really was quite a chemical kosh. They were not very well refined, and I think and had awful side effects. And I think people were focused on managing symptoms rather than thinking about people and their lives and their context. What has happened is a refinement and sort of various breakthroughs, so that now the medications we have are much more refined, and certainly something that I think we've done in early intervention in psychosis is promote low or no dose. So in other words, in chemistry, there's something called titration, where, for example, you're dripping potassium permanganate, which turns pink when it drops into acid. And the titration point is when it first turns the palest pink. to just turn the acid.
Yeah.
And in the same way, that's what we would advocate in terms, I don't prescribe, but in terms of medications, the lowest possible dose to impact on symptoms so that you don't impair other areas of people's functioning.
And
Now,
that's
sometimes
part of the whole stepped care approach, isn't it?
it
You're always
is,
looking for
and
the lowest
certainly,
intervention.
yeah, and there are a group of people who can manage off medication, you know, without medication, but we don't know who they are. So typically, first line, everyone will be given medication, but you're trying to give them the lowest possible dose to impact on their symptoms, and then if people do well and as they start to recover, you start reducing that dose, and some people can manage on no dose.
Yeah.
And so my work was at an individual level, helping people manage distressing symptoms like delusions and auditory hallucinations of what we call voices, but also the knock-on effects on identity or image, where people sort of perhaps perceive themselves perhaps differently, negatively, because they'd had a psychosis, or maybe became depressed because they felt they didn't have a future for themselves. So my task was to hold on to hope till they could hold on to it for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And then also help them create a life that they wanted to be in. And that was a team approach, helping people either stay in education or get back into education, and pick up on qualifications, or stay in employment or get back into employment, supporting their family, trying to keep them in contact with their friends and their social networks, all of those aspects, and that was something that we promoted, a model of care. When I was, let me think, about 1993 or 4, I had the opportunity to meet with a GP called David Shires. He worked in Staffordshire, and his daughter Mary had developed psychosis age 15. And I think for David, it was the first time that he saw mental health services from the perspective as a parent rather than as a professional. Now, he's very values driven and would have been very caring, very thoughtful with families who appeared in his surgery. And he would have tried to do the best by them. But when he saw Mary, she went into a child and adolescent service that at that time didn't do much in terms of psychosis, and was told to wait till she was 16 till adult services kicked in. Of course, now it's 18. And in fact, when adult services kicked in, instead of feeling relieved, she was just admitted to an adult psychiatric hospital, where she stayed and was really plied with cake and puddings, and developed weight gain, and then their marker of success was she aged 17 was moved to a rehabilitation hostel with 7 men in the community. But Mary was a dancer, she liked shopping, she hadn't finished the qualifications, and no one seemed that bothered about that. People felt that they should be happy that she was out of a psychiatric hospital. And so David started campaigning, and it got to the ears of the mental health lead in the region, who brought together me and a couple of other colleagues who were working in psychosis, and we formed a group called IRIS, the Initiative to Reduce the Impact of Schizophrenia, and we pushed a model of care called Early Intervention in Psychosis in England, and that got to the ears of government. And eventually, government invested in that in 2002 as part of the National Service Framework. And we had 2 early intervention services then in the country, one in Birmingham, one in London. And Worcester, where I am, I pushed locally, and we were the 6th early intervention service. And we initially set off as one service covering the county, then eventually became 2 teams, and I was the clinical lead for those 2 teams.
Tell us about early intervention, because again, and I'm fully with you that MDTs, multidisciplinary teams, complex approaches from lots of disciplines are really what's needed. And there's no, I don't particularly as a professional make a distinction necessarily between psychological and psychiatric. They go hand in hand without a doubt. There is a difference though in perception, if you like, that the medical model is about treating an illness, whereas the psychological model is about something else. It's not cure. It's about looking at life and the quality of life, I guess. I'm guessing that's what the early intervention model is about.
Well, the early intervention model is treating what you see rather than what it might become.
Right.
So you treat as early as possible, even sort of, as I say, when you get what are called an at-risk mental state, where people have got very brief and limited intermittent psychotic symptoms. And it's very much about treating people in non-stigmatized settings, which is why I changed to home visiting, because I would go and see people in colleges in their lunchtime or after they'd finished at college, or we'd go and see them at their uni, or we'd see them in their home. And we wouldn't bring them into a clinic or a hospital setting. And there would be a team which would be made up of psychiatry, psychology, occupational therapy, nurses, employment and education specialists, physical health specialists. We set up something in Worcester called SHAPE, which was the supporting health and exercise program. And that was run in a gym, and that was about addressing weight gain and getting people moving and addressing issues around diet and and body image, and that was a very successful model. And early intervention now as a model of care has been rolled out internationally. It's had a huge impact. It's reduced the suicide rates for young people with psychosis from between 10 to 15% down to about 1%. In fact, less than 1% internationally. And that's because people are in a life they want to be in.
That's right. But tell me, when you say, because you know what this means, when you say you treat what's presented rather than what you think might happen, what does that mean?
Okay. I think people often, when originally giving a diagnosis of something like schizophrenia or psychosis, it was almost the diagnosis that they didn't dare say because it had such a negative connotation that it would likely mean that you'd be hospitalized, that you'd have repeat episodes and you wouldn't be able to work and all sorts of things. And that just isn't the case. I mean, we have shifted and challenged thinking about psychosis and enable people to get back into ordinary lives and what we say, and have the same expectations of life and life expectations as people who don't have psychosis. And so some of the work that David Shires has gone on to do and on physical health has been about the mortality risk because of maybe some of the medications, but also some lifestyle issues, poverty trap, all those kind of things that mean that people maybe don't have healthy diets, aren't so mobile, can't afford a gym, addressing that risk by getting people focused on getting people physically well as mentally well. So it's a very holistic approach. And as I say, employment and education sits there equally as treating symptoms.
Absolutely. And so in some ways, we could say the previous model may have created some of the problems that he was seeking to solve, whereas this model is about, well, what are you looking at? We also know in general what makes for a good life for people. We would like you to have that good life as much as anybody else.
And support you in doing that and recognise, that not everyone can be symptom-free, but it doesn't mean that they can't return to education or return to work if they've got tools in their bag for coping with those symptoms. And it doesn't mean that people won't necessarily have a relapse at some point. But what you're doing is putting tools in their bag to spot early signs and do something about it. to prevent it escalating into a psychotic episode. So you teach people about managing sleep, managing anxiety, managing mood, and also managing psychotic symptoms, so that they've got tools in their bag, and support the family to support them too.
In terms of current thinking as well, thinks a lot about trauma as being part of, and stress as being part of these issues.
Yeah.
What's your thinking now around those things? So I remember it was the Institute of Psychiatry did some research. Oh, my thumbs signs. Don't know why it does this. I don't know if you can see the thumb sign.
Yeah.
The Institute of Psychiatry a few years, well, this is pre-pandemic, did some research showing that 87% of people with psychosis clearly have trauma symptoms and you know, PTSD symptoms.
Yeah.
What would you say, do you think, is the relationship?
Yeah, I think what we need to recognise is that adverse childhood experiences and trauma early on is a marker for a whole series of later difficulties. It hasn't, and some of the work I've done on student suicide, there's been work done in Northern Ireland. Siobhan O'Neill and Margaret McLafferty again showed that it perhaps contributed to the greater risk of suicidality in your 20s. So yes, trauma is a combat, and often may not have been dealt with at that time, or not addressed, or someone may not have been in a position to address it. Added to that, trauma can often occur at any point in someone's life. You know, loss of a parent growing up, traumatic experiences that people have, and sometimes I think has been missed and sort of diagnosed as something else. And certainly as a psychologist, we don't tend to work so much in diagnostically. We work what we call phenomenologically, working with what someone's presenting with. And often you try and understand the narrative that had brought someone to that point in terms of the story. And that story might well have trauma within it, which you would address as part of that narrative, and find that in many people, symptoms sort of abated as they addressed that trauma. But I think we also have to recognise that trauma, when it happens, I mean, it's been shown that the way in which we lay down those memories and experiences are laid much deeper. You know, we form neural pathways, and so what we're trying to do is unpick basically experiences which have been laid down in a much more powerful way, and particularly if it's pre-verbal as well. I think there was an assumption that if you weren't verbal, but of course we lay it down differently when we don't have the language for it. And we don't really have language for emotion until we're about 7.
Exactly. But we do have experience, and that experience
so trauma does play a part.
Absolutely. And we also know it's body motivated as well. Body sits in the body, the fast
absolutely
brain structures. There's also that bit of psychosis where the trauma from treatment for people as well. So like the Mental Health Act admissions and stuff like that.
Oh yes,
being on the wards, etc. Those difficult experiences that people can have.
But that's what early intervention sought to do, to try and dramatically reduce the likelihood of hospital admission. And certainly in Worcestershire, in our first 11 years of opening, you know, we had driven down the admission rate down to somewhere around about 11%. And again, the number of use of the Mental Health Act was like dramatically cut in those who were hospitalised, and that's because you're getting in much earlier. And again, we had a big impact on suicide rates, which probably segues us into my more recent work.
We're not going to go down the Mental Health Act. Because otherwise you and I would just be there for the next 20 years talking about it. There's a review coming up, hopefully, and hopefully we'll come to the right conclusion. So in terms of the suicide work, and I just want to say, as we're using that word, for people that are listening, if you're having suicidal ideation, that happens, and there are support services around. We're going to be talking about this subject now, but you can get hold of organisations like Samaritans 24/7. Absolutely will be the end of the phone for you. If you are having these thoughts and you've not talked to anybody about it because you're afraid of them, do talk to somebody. I promise you, you're not going to get a reaction where people drag you off to a hospital and sort of lock you up. That isn't what happens. What will happen is people will be kind to you, and it's the first stage in stopping these thoughts from taking over is to talk to somebody about them. So I would
And
encourage
the other
you.
thing is, there is something called Shout, which is the crisis text line 24/7, which is
Wonderful.
actually manned by trained volunteers, but behind them sit therapists. And so again, for people who aren't comfortable necessarily with talking verbally, there is, if you look up the Shout crisis text line, that's 24 hours, 7 days a week. And that has therapists sitting behind it, and has been a very successful additional model to the work of Samaritans, but also Papyrus for young people.
Yes. Yeah.
Have their Hope line, which I would highly recommend again for young people to
And
access.
if you're watching the video, just look underneath and you'll see all the contact details for these organisations there, so that you don't have to scrabble around. You can Google them yourself, but we will make sure that they are there when this show goes out. And the basic message is there is help, and use it. that's what was
Absolutely. Absolutely.
using help will reduce the risk of you doing something permanently damaging to yourself.
But also seeking help early when problems start, because often when people reach the point of feeling that perhaps they might want to end their lives, it's often at a point where they feel hopeless and helpless, and perhaps isolated. And so what I would encourage people to do is much early on connect with people who enable your being, who are important to you, whether it be friends or family or work colleagues, and whatever issues, even though they may seem very big to you, actually sharing them, talking with someone, allows you to perhaps problem solve and find ways out of that without having to think about an escape option. And certainly there are many options available, but you need to speak up and seek help early is what I would encourage you to do. Don't leave it and ruminate.
I mean, it's interesting, and there may be gender differences as well, and you can confirm or deny this, but certainly men of my age, for example, wait far too long to talk about stuff.
I think in fact that may be changing, because I think we're now all men and women more emotionally literate. But yes, in terms of groups who are at risk, middle-aged men, but also younger men. But actually, we've seen younger women now. We've seen a rise in rates for younger women too. So it isn't so. It is male dominated 2-to-1, but in certain age groups, and certainly in sort of young people, women it's rising. And
we've seen a slight uptick in underage drinking in girls as well, haven't we, with the latest report, which is very worrying, because drinking at any time is often associated with coping strategies anyway. Certainly underage drinking is a real disaster. So tell us about this whole field. How did you get involved in suicide prevention?
I moved over to the university 11 years ago, and again, I met with a family. I was asked by my Vice-Chancellor, David Green, and I met with a family whose son had died by suicide at Newcastle University. And initially, I didn't make the link with my work with young people in psychosis. But as I talked with them, and they invited me to meet with other families, so I actually went to London and met about 7 other families who had been bereaved, that had lost their sons or daughters at university. And that was something that was quite important to me. When I met David Shires with psychosis, one of the things that we set out at that time was to find out whether David's story was unique in terms of what happened to Mary. And so one of the things that I did at the time with colleagues was I did an audit in Worcestershire of the previous 3 years of everyone with the psychosis, and there were audits carried out in about 6 other places. And what that revealed was a common picture. It wasn't unique to David in Staffordshire. It was happening in various areas in the country, well, in fact, all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. And so my immediate reaction with meeting this family was to want to meet with others to see, was this something that was unique to Newcastle or their son? And one thing I've learned, I've got involved in something called social movement. People may think about social movement like in terms of maybe feminism or climate change or women's rights, or there's a whole series of social movements. But one of the things about social movements is that you can have an academic knowledge about something, but actually, in order to really drive system change, it's got to come from the heart. You've got to be passionate about it. And you need to ride those twin chariots, because passion alone will burn out. So you need this twin chariot of academic knowledge with heart. And talking to those families, I found very emotive, because I've got sons in the same age group.
Absolutely.
And I became passionate, wanting to make a difference with those families. I couldn't make a difference for those families, but we could perhaps make a difference for young people moving forward and future families. And so that passion led me, first of all, to set up a project supported by David Green and colleagues at University of Worcester called the Suicide Safer Project, which was designed to think about what as a single university, a small to medium-sized university, could do. But then moving on from there, it got the attention nationally about this project. I started talking. Initially, people asked me, was there a problem at Worcester that we had to have a project? And it reminded me of psychosis again. I'm trying to make the links between the two. And I thought, that's interesting. People saying that, is it a problem for Worcester, rather than actually recognise maybe there was a problem. And someone said to me, it's such a low incidence phenomenon that, someone dying by suicide at a university, in a big university like, say, Manchester, of sort of, 50, 60,000, you might have maybe 2 or 3 students a year, but in a small university, you might have 1 every 3 years. And so people said low incidence. And I thought, I've heard this before with psychosis. It's a low incidence phenomena, but it's high cost.
Yeah.
You lose a young person's life, you lose all of their future, and then you impact, it's a grief that knows no end, and impacts on peers, on staff, on family, and it impacts on institutions. It's extremely costly in terms of reputation damage, and also just the knock-on effects of that. It can bring a university to a standstill when there is student death. And so I suppose I started realising that I was articulating similar arguments for a different problem. And that brought me in contact with various people, Student Minds, Universities UK, the National Union of Students. And the first thing that we did with National Union of Students was set up a student suicide roundtable. And out of that, NUS in 2015 published guidance for student unions in terms of preventing student suicide. And then from there, with Universities UK, we produced a guidance called Suicide Safer Universities. That was in 2018. And then from then on, I've sort of gone on and done various bits. So I edited a book here, which is Preventing and Responding to Student Suicide. And that was bringing together best evidence, research, but also practice and lived experience from survivors and family members And it is unique. There wasn't a book like that. That was published in 2022. And then my contact, because I'd sort of developed a bit of an expertise, I was approached by Middlesex University about 4 years ago, where they had unfortunately had more than one student death in a short space of time. And they were very values driven. That's what I'd say about my experience there. They were very keen to learn, had they done enough to support students and staff and families? And so I got talking to David Malpass from Middlesex, who was the lead then. And in fact, I said, look, let's get together a whole series of universities who've been through a similar experience. And so we formed a reference group which met and involved bereaved families from the Learn Network. And we produced this guidance, which is how to respond to student suicide, which has been picked up by government, and all universities in England are required to follow that. It's also being picked up in Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland. It's being used by the National Confidential Inquiry, because within it there are tools and resources, and there's a template when there is a student death for people to learn from that student death in terms of, rather than trying to close down, to actually look at all the factors leading, and are there things that a university can do to change? And now the National Confidential Inquiry is auditing those reports to look at specifically at that. And then from that, the work with Middlesex and that initial work, which was published in 2022, we've gone on with a whole set of other universities from across the 4 nations and Ireland, and bereaved families from the Learn Network, to produce another guidance, which is about to be published, on restricting access to means of suicide in higher education. And that's taking it beyond student support to thinking about building design, thinking about estates reviews, thinking about access to labs and chemicals, all of those things. And that's going to be published this summer.
Which brings me to 2 questions, which I think are connected. One to the social movement, but also you mentioned that often people will say things like, it's a low incidence, therefore why would we invest in it? And then your counter argument is quite appropriate. Well, it's high risk. So it's an XY axis. It may be low risk, but the consequences are very high.
Yeah.
And that's simple risk management thing. But also 2 things occur to me, and I wonder what you think about this. One is that I don't think people genuinely understand that if you make somewhere suicide safer, they may focus on the word suicide, but it's the safer that is important. You're making somewhere safer. So there's a broader impact than saving one life. You're actually doing a lot of things that are improving the quality of a space psychologically, physically, in all sorts of ways, and you're making it safer in a lot of ways, because the sort of things that make somewhere suicide safer just generally is good for human beings, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, to recognise that this is,
because I know you're very passionate. I just want to stop you because I want to connect it also to the social movement issue. And for me, and I was just writing about it this morning, that we need to re-engage with this idea that civil society is important, that if we engage with psychologically informed approaches that are human and humane within society as a whole, we improve the lot of everybody. And that and particularly for young people, and this is what I was writing about for young people, is that we really need to re-engage with a young person's sense in which they want to improve the world and give that productive outlets. So that sort of area, I wonder what you think about that stuff.
It's been quite important with my work, certainly all the way through, but about involving people with lived experience. Now that's, and that might mean peers, like people like Fiona Druitt, whose brother died from suicide. Or these are people who set up charities. Her brother was on a placement, so she's keen at looking at placement students, but also working with families. And sometimes what you have is quite opposing views. You can have people who are very, very angry. And one thing I feel pleased about is if you can bring people together with quite disparate views, but have a common purpose,
Yeah.
you can turn that anger into passion to change. And, you know, energy can't be destroyed, but you can convert it. And I've seen that conversion with families where we've been able to turn their anger into hope. And for them to see that there are people who are really, really trying to make changes across the sector.
And
That's from Vice Chancellor level. It's the most difficult thing for a Vice Chancellor. A death by suicide stays with you, whatever you are, in a way. It just impacts. They do, and most Vice Chancellors I've talked to said it was the most difficult conversations they've had with families, and they will remember the names of students. And so one thing that I would say that has underpinned my earlier work and this work is about values, and about principles. Because sometimes I think what has happened is perhaps people have lost sight of humanness, in terms of perhaps a university following a process, but forgetting empathy, compassion, humanity in it. And so one of the things about that, in all of the guidance we've written, is very much about trying to make explicit the principles by which one may enact processes, and also the values that underpin this. And I think one thing that I've been lucky enough with colleagues from Middlesex and elsewhere, Manchester, Belfast, is finding colleagues who share that same passion and values, and being able to harness. And the lovely thing with the work is we've been able to harness research which has been carried out, which perhaps gets a platform in journals, but not everyone reads journals. But we've been able to, when we've been suggesting practice, we've been able to make sure that it's evidence informed. In other words, that it's evidence-based practice. So we've been able to use the research to say, this has got good evidence behind it, and also to highlight maybe where perhaps universities need to be wary, where there hasn't been enough research, where it's easy to throw money at, I don't know, short-term training or apps and think, well, that's our solution. But in fact, maybe there isn't enough evidence yet to say that that actually is, you know, an effective use of money.
Like the plethora of mental health first aid trainings, which I'm not against. I think they're great, but you know, we need to go further. We are at the end of time. I did sort of say we would run out of time. We always do. I mean, sort of my sense is that this is very much about an asset-based approach, that it's not looking at the problem, but what are the solutions? Where's the evidence for the solutions? And generally, I guess those solutions make the world a better place. That's my experience. And that's always welcome. What we'll make sure, Jo, is that people get links to the book so that they can get hold of them. They'll be underneath, as well as the organizations. I know that you're more freelance consultancy type these days. Do you have a website where people get hold of you, or is it just
well, they can get hold of me through University of Worcester. I have an email address there, so they can contact me through that. But no, I don't. I mean,
that, and then we can put it out to people, and they can get hold of you, because I'm guessing people who are listening might want to send you, ask for information or signposting. You're comfortable with doing that, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. Right. The difficulty I have is where perhaps people come with particularly around psychosis, with perhaps individual issues where they're trying to access care locally or whatever, and I struggle with, because I don't have the same linkages. But where I can help, I will do that.
Also, people can send questions to me, and then I can pass them on to you as well. So that's that. We can sort of filter it that way. And I you know, it's been a real pleasure for me to have this conversation with you. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been
We could have
extraordinarily.
gone on longer. We could have gone on longer. I was trying to make sure that Middlesex, who set it up, did get a look in, because of course my career, I always, because my OBE was for the student suicide work over the last 11 years, whereas I've done 30 years in early intervention. I'm still a national clinical advisor for
Right.
early intervention in psychosis. And when, I mean, this is not being recorded, but when the OBE award letter came through, I was disappointed because it wasn't for my early intervention in psychosis work.
It's okay.
And because that probably was where my heart lay. I think it's become a new now. I quite like the narrative that's developed over 11 years and how it's all come together.
Yeah.
But yeah, my heart has always lain in young people with mental health problems,
Well,
serious mental health problems, and so there's a link between the two. It's quite
absolutely.
logical once you get it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It actually was recorded. I'll take it out if you want, but I think it's you from your heart saying where your love is a really touching moment. And people need to understand that. It's what you said about values-based approaches. Healers have values. That's why we do it.
Yeah. Okay. What I want to feel is that in the course of, I've been given skills and gifts, and what I want was to have used them and to have left a footprint in the sand. It will be a footprint in the sand because eventually that sand will move and change and blow and it'll move forward, which is what it needs to do. But I'd like to feel that in my time on this earth that I have hopefully impacted on individuals, on families,
Yeah.
on models of care,
Yeah.
both in health and in higher education, and that the world is better for the bits I've done, recognizing there are limits on that. That's what I'd like to think.
I pretty much guarantee that is the truth. Just from having talked to you this hour, I'm pretty sure that that's a fact. You stay there. I'm going to say goodbye to people. I hope you've all enjoyed this as much as I have. Do remember, if you're struggling, there is help, and get help. And also, this whole idea of early intervention, you know, for me, it starts with looking at a healthy lifestyle anyway. And so there's a lot you can do that is preventative in terms of your mental health, your physical health, and getting involved in your nutrition, your exercise, your social connection, reducing your risk factors from using alcohol, all that sort of stuff. You know, this healthy lifestyle approach really, really helps folk. And it's really important, even if you have a severe and enduring mental health problem, all these other things will reduce the difficulties that you have. So you're going to say goodbye to Jo, going to say goodbye to everybody else, and we'll see you at the next show. So thank you very much.